Hi, I'm Chuck Olenek. I'm a reenactor. And for 36 years, I used living history, both as a hobby, which I still am engaged in, and as something that I could use in the classroom to bring this subject to life for my students and engage them. Well, I'm not in the classroom anymore. And I still have a room full of garb at home that I can't bear to get rid of. And a passion for bringing the past to life, and a desire to play history detective. So when I was repurposing myself and figuring out what I was going to do, I decided to take a deep dive into California history, and I started exploring the missions and the presidios and the assistencias and telling the stories of those places in garb. And then I went up and was filming in Russian California and playing history detective there. And I noticed when I was working on the missions, particularly Mission San Miguel, I noticed a reference to saloons in the mission. Well, the missions were desecularized, but there were saloons in the mission, and that there were several famous outlaws that hung out in these saloons. So I've started chasing bandidos and outlaws and following the trails of lawmen. And what I'm doing now is I'm picking up the story of Chris Evans, who was a partner with John Sontag. They were train robbers at the Battle of Stone Corral. Sontag and Evans were ambushed. Sontag was wounded unto death. He told his partner Chris Evans to get out, get away, either kill him or leave, and reminded him that Evans had a family. And what ended up finally happening is Evans finally acquiesced and he left. He couldn't bear to kill John Sontag. John Sontag ends up dying of his wounds. He dies possibly from tetanus like 3 weeks later. And Chris Evans is brought to the Fresno County Jail. The old jailhouse in Monterey is going to have to stand in because the Fresno County Jail was demolished. And so, Evans is there. He's lost an eye. He's also lost, his left hand and part of that arm. So he's being fitted with a prosthetic. And okay, he's, sitting in on his trial, and that's going on for a couple of weeks. And, he's hearing the charges against him. And while the trial is going on, he's sitting in jail, and he's being allowed certain privileges. He's being allowed visitors. He is, so his daughter Eva is coming to visit, and he's allowed to, his meals come from the Stock restaurant, and that's the meals for all the inmates. They're showing up there, and a man named Ed Morrell, who's an ex-con, he's the one bringing the meals. Well, Ed and Chris start talking, and Ed is enamored of Eva. And what ends up happening is Morrell walks in with the food, and what he's got under the napkin are 2 revolvers. He hands one to Evans. They take the guard. They are walking him out. Oh, by the way, there's this sheriff thing. The sheriff would be kind of inconvenient to have around. Well, Morrell had told him that he'd heard there was going to be a train robbery over at Porterville. So the sheriff and a lot of the deputies had cleared out. So what's ending up happening is now we have Evans and Morrell walking the guard out. They get out into the street. They run into the mayor, or ex-mayor of Fresno, take him hostage, and then as they are trying to escape, they manage to get to a buggy. They steal that. They take off into the night. And this is going to be really embarrassing for law enforcement officials because the newspapers are going to town and they're writing all about this stuff. And they're making the Fresno law enforcement folks look real dumb. In the weeks that follow Evans and Morrell's flight from Fresno, it's a redo of Evans and Sontag on the run. The Outlaws are clearly getting help from people in the mountains. They're getting supplies. They're getting food. They're clearly being given some shelter, or at least their whereabouts are being protected, except that when this is really frustrating the law, reporters are able to gain access to the pair and interview them. And there's sketches appearing in, the various newspapers of these guys. And, like there's one sketch where Evans still has his arm, holding a rifle. So that must have been the artist kind of, figuring out what he would have looked like. And then there's another sketch of the way Evans is demonstrating his shooting technique with a rifle, with the with his artificial arm. And it's getting really frustrating for the law. Their primary retreat was a cabin totally hidden within a stand of manzanita above San Joaquin Valley. The only entrance was strung with warning devices. Dynamite wired to a battery near the cabin was buried beneath the path. When lawmen found the cabin, they riddled it with bullets from 4 directions, then rushed in, only to find it deserted. The Outlaws had abandoned it, even leaving their overcoats, and Evans had left his artificial arm. Salvaging only Evans' artificial arm and a few other items, the lawmen then burned the cabin. After a blizzard drove them to shelter with the Yokuts, the fugitives made it to the home of Ed and Lucy Mainwaring, who provided Evans with care. A couple caring for the Evans children, Evans' wife and daughter, were on a tour of a play about Evans' life, turned out to be working for the railroad and used a ruse that one of the sons was deathly ill. When Evans and Morrell arrived at the Evans home, they found that this was a ruse. This was a trick. Carl was okay. But by this point, the law had surrounded the house, and a series of notes were exchanged between the sheriff and Evans. And it kind of worked out a deal of like, all right, we're going to surrender. So Evans and Morrell come out of the cabin. They meet the sheriff and his deputy in the yard. They shake hands and they turn themselves in. Chris Evans is going to be sentenced to life in prison at Folsom, and initially Ed Morrell is going to be sent there too. And at this time, George Contant, previously known as George Sontag, John Sontag's brother, the one that ended up getting caught during the train robbery at Colas, well, he's been locked up in prison for a while, and he tries an escape attempt and gets himself crippled in the process. So obviously he didn't really get away. And he decides to testify against his one-time partner. That earns him the hatred of the Evans family for like ever. Doesn't really change things though. So, all right, we have Chris Evans locked down in Folsom, and the thing is, there is a cellmate he ends up getting who is an interesting character, Dick Fellows. Dick Fellows was a notorious stage robber. He was incredibly daring as far as the robberies he committed or the escape attempts, actually successful escapes. You know, kind of like Steve McQueen in The Great Escape, right? Except that he was cursed with bad horsemanship, which really was kind of important at the time, and also just a lot of bad luck. But he managed to pull off like a dozen, stagecoach robberies. Well, one of the detectives for Wells Fargo who pursued uh, Dick Fellows, ends up as the warden of Folsom. Fellows is there. He decides, okay, let's put these two guys together in a cell. Because he noticed, the warden noticed something. Dick Fellows is really smooth talking, had a great calming effect on the inmates. He was such a smooth talker, he managed to get himself reduced sentences at different times. All right, so Fellows is now Evan's roommate, cellmate. Okay, and the two guys get along great. They're fantastic. They both love to talk. They both love to read. So they get to talk about the stuff they read too. They both like to write. So this is going to work out great. Well, this is going to go on until Fellows is released in 1903 and then kind of disappears from history. And so here's Evans in his cell. He ends up turning to socialism, which intrigued him, and I think it fit with his hatred of the railroads and big corporations. Just like Dick Fellows had a vendetta against Wells Fargo. He hated large corporations. So Evans turns to socialism. He writes a book called Eurasia. Kind of sets up an idea of how government needs to be expanded in order to serve as watchdogs on the corruption of large corporations. Okay, he's going to get released around 1911, and he is banished from the state of California. You were bad, you stole stuff, you killed people, go away. And so he ends up moving to Oregon, and he lives with his daughter Eva. And when he passes on in 1917, he ends up getting buried up in Portland. Ed Morrell is going to serve 14 years. He becomes a symbol of the railroads, and that makes him a target for torture. And he is blamed for an escape attempt, which he didn't get out. And so he is shipped from Folsom over to San Quentin. And there he is actually going to he'll do 5 years solitary. And he was called the Dungeon Master because of this. Well, his cause was championed by writer Jack London. His wife ended up writing a book called The 25th Man, which was about prison reform, and it ended up actually becoming a model that was used by Arizona for prison reform. And when he's released, he'll end up going around lecturing on that topic. Well, Jack London's going to take Ed Morrell's story, he's going to also use his name, and he's going to write a book called The Star Rover. And in that book, there is a prisoner who is continually tortured, and what he ends up doing, he's supposed to, I guess, be wearing what was called the jacket, which was a super tight jacket, which kind of compressed everything together, and I guess it hurt. And as far as the character that's in the book, he escapes this stuff by taking walks out here, and he was basically visiting different time periods and other lives. And this is the story. So in a way, London's kind of inspired by Morrell. Oh, and he also uses Morrell's name for one of the characters. Well, this book gets real popular, and it was interesting to hear, like, H.P. Lovecraft evidently was inspired by it to use, the idea of, going to, going beyond the silver gates to dreamland. So, interesting stuff. George Contant, John Sontag's brother, he is going to serve about 15 years. When he finally gets out, when he's finally pardoned, he and a ghostwriter, Opie Warner, end up writing his autobiography, A Pardoned Lifer, in which he warns of the evils of living a life of crime. He's also going to hit the lecture circuit and travel about doing that, selling the same message. He is also going to produce a movie on the same topic. No copies of the movie happen to exist now. Well, looks like I have told that tale. Now it's time for me to move on and find some other part of California history and probably chase more bandidos. I hope you stick with me on my journey.